Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode, excuse me, of Ask Professor Paranormal. That's me, Lloyd Auerbach. So we have a few people here today. Hoping we get a few more coming. It's a little bit, the schedule went a little bit off the rails because I was out of town last weekend. But we're back for every 2 weeks, at least for a couple months. There'll be another interruption somewhere in the fall. We'll get to that as we get closer to the time. So, of course, this is for everybody to ask questions, make some comments on the paranormal, on parapsychology, ask me to provide sources, and then, of course, I can just simply go off and do some monologuing if we don't get any questions at all. I always have a couple of things I can talk about. Hi, Paul. Welcome. And welcome to everybody else who's here as well. So first of all, let me just, and I'll do this a couple of times, my producer will be popping into the chat a link to a panel discussion I just did on Thursday morning, hosted by Tell Me Your Story, which I believe is from India. One of the folks was actually in India, another in the UK, and I was here in a very, very early morning Pacific time, talking about dreams, hypnosis, and reincarnation. Really interesting discussion, and I do recommend everybody kind of take a look at it. What are the strongest theories supported by evidence to life after death? Okay, well, taking the first question first. I can't say theory because we don't know what consciousness is. So until we have an idea of what consciousness is, we don't really have a theory of what makes it up. You know, the big question for us when we look at the evidence is not whether something survives the death of the body, but what is it that survives the death of the body? Consciousness, spirit, soul, mind, whatever you want to call it. Human personality was the phrase that the early researchers actually used. So there's not really a theory other than a model that somehow consciousness itself, which is how, you know, extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, all those things are functions of consciousness that allows someone without a body to, of course, perceive and interact with the world. But survival of consciousness, with the exception of reincarnation cases, relies on understanding what consciousness is. Once we know what it is in the body, we might have a better idea of how it could exist outside the body or without the body being alive. You know, there's certainly a significant amount of evidence that supports that consciousness can separate from the body, can exist in some form, can interact in some form, although it can also be interpreted by some materials in my field by saying, well, there are some people that might have super duper ESP and that can explain everything. And most of us on the survival side don't really buy that. It's just explaining one sort of unknown with a really bigger unknown that we have. The where. The where is a big question. You know, I don't know that where is the right question. And it may be that consciousness transforms in some way. You know, some people have posited that it's a different dimensional plane of existence. You know, certainly that sounds like a metaphysical concept, but physicists have determined that the universe is composed of many more than the 4 dimensions we talk about. They've mathematically described anywhere from 11 to 27, maybe even 29 dimensions. And consciousness may be something, even in our heads, may not be fully just in the 3 and 4, you know, 3 and 4 dimensions that we actually have. What's described by people with a near-death experience who have gone through the tunnel or across the bridge, who occasionally see the landscape, and people who are mediums who ask the spirits they're communicating with, what is it like on the other side, is something that can only be discussed or even described in human terms. In other words, there's a limitation of language and concept that we all run into when trying to describe something that's totally alien. Now, maybe the afterlife's not an alien world. Maybe, you know, in other words, it's very much like our world because it may be created by consciousness. All of things being consciousness. One example in movies I can refer to, movies, and actually the book is much better, is the book and movie What Dreams May Come by Richard Matheson. It's the movie with Robin Williams and Cuba Gooding Jr., in which everyone in the afterlife creates their own afterlife. Their consciousness impacts things including negative Somebody depressed or suicidal in life or committed suicide might have a very depressing life afterlife because that's what they create for themselves. Typically, mediums do refer to a very pleasant world where people can talk to each other. They may be able to get things, but the reality is, in talking to many mediums and talking to others, is that it may be more different than we can possibly imagine. And any description makes it's very, very difficult to describe things that we can't imagine because they're so, and I hate to use the word alien, but that is the right word. They're alien to our thought processes and what we know here in the physical world. Can't really say. Okay, let's see. And good evening to you too, Edgar, as well. Hi, Tina. Hi, Paul. Many theories of consciousness. Yeah, there are many theories and models of consciousness and speculations from science fiction writers and comic book writers. Someone's probably right. Maybe everybody's right. It's kind of like, are we describing consciousness like the five blind men trying to describe an elephant from touching different parts of the elephant? Is that what we're dealing with here? Yeah, David Chalmers talks about the real, and it is a hard problem of consciousness, trying to describe it. I think I've mentioned this before. So just to paraphrase Ambrose Bierce from his book, The Devil's Dictionary, which is a great sarcastic book of definitions from the early 20th centuries, that the mind has a basic problem. This is a paraphrase. The mind is the only thing that studies itself. So whatever we do in studying the mind and consciousness, we may be studying the brain, we're studying behavior, we're kind of studying ourselves, and that means we have just automatically it's all subjective to some extent. So there's a soft and hard problem with trying to define consciousness and study consciousness. In some respects, parapsychology has been attracting people from outside our field who are looking at questions of consciousness, partly because we study phenomena of consciousness itself. So ESP, extrasensory perception, that's non-sensory perception, is consciousness directly perceiving things, gathering information, or putting out information. Psychokinesis is consciousness directly affecting or interacting with the physical world, including our own bodies. So really, psi, as we call it, is epiphenomena of consciousness, and certainly looking at survival, that's a big thing too. I mentioned reincarnation before. It's really, it's a bit of a consternation even for the materialists in parapsychology, simply because the alternative that materials talk about is that the ESP of living people is what gathers the information, and then our minds make up a ghost, or basically kind of give clothing, metaphorical clothing to the information we get, and make us think that we're interacting with something. That the near-death experience, you're not really communicating with anyone when you go through the tunnel or across the bridge. It's all information you've gathered from other sources and so on. And the thing is that there's no form of ESP, no instance of ESP other than survival-related stuff that seems to be as good quality or have the same kind of patterns. So that idea of super ESP or super psi does tend to fall apart a little bit. With reincarnation, the kids that are studied, children who remember previous lives, and there are now thousands of good cases out there since 1960, with rare exception, do not display any psychic abilities whatsoever. None. So to say that those past life memories are because the child's really, really, really psychic, and for whatever reason has selectively picked up on one person in the past who died, never anybody who's alive, which is also really weird, doesn't make any sense at all. Not logically, not intuitively, not at all. But we don't know if reincarnation is consciousness or the soul being reborn, or if there's something else going on altogether. We don't know. Again, we don't know what consciousness is. So that's a really unusual thing there as well. Let's see, Darren Mack, who hosts Seeking Eye. I've done an interview with Darren. He's a really good interviewer. Just really had a good discussion with him. Interviewing Susan Blackmore. Okay, that'll be pretty interesting to see, because Sue is an absolute diehard skeptic, or in some respects disbeliever these days. John, good to see you here as well. Glad that folks actually made it. All right, so we come to a little stopping point here. Oh, Night Souls, we are consciousness. That is true. And, some really interesting ideas out there. If you look into quantum physics especially, you'll see that often the word consciousness is used as kind of a substrata of the universe, but they're not talking about human consciousness, certainly. So a little different. And actually I've read articles in the past of folks in quantum physics who suggest, excuse me, my allergies have been acting up today, who suggest that the small, we can go down to the quantum level, which is subatomic, but there's a suggestion that the smallest piece of the universe, the substrata, which also is consciousness, is information, that we're all made up of information, which is also pretty interesting in itself. So a lot of interesting stuff out there. I think that go back 30 years ago, and very few people were studying consciousness at all as an idea of what is that question. Today, it is the hard question in science, and it's coming up in more and more places. And fortunately, it is totally cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary. Interestingly enough, I see the one field that should be studying it more, psychology's not. So that's pretty interesting in itself. Whole world inside a shoebox, or inside the matrix, if you want to go with the simulation theory, which I personally hold no, I don't think that's right at all. Susanna referred to my experience of at a cabin, a jot. Always question the psychokinesis suggestion. You're so bad at it. Well, people can be. So first of all, jot, for those who don't know, stands for just one of those things. That describes specific common instances of disappearing objects and then reappearing objects. In other words, you go looking for something and it's gone and it maybe reappears in a different place. Or you search for it, looking for your keys, and you can't find them, and other people are around, can't find them either. And yet, at some point, they show up directly in front of you on the table where they were to begin with all along. Now, it's possible with an individual that a single person might have a negative hallucination. In other words, our perception is blocking us from seeing something for some reason. But, it doesn't work with a lot of people. And it also doesn't work with physically going for stuff. Susanna, if you think there are entities involved, the question we always have when we have these little jot things happening, or computer issues or other things that are seemingly unexplained, is there any other evidence that there's someone besides yourself who is present and interacting there? Anything at all? And if there's not, we have to go with the simplest explanation. That's kind of an important thing for us. All right. And of course, if an entity is moving something, it's still psychokinesis. So just because a human's not doing it, PK is not limited to human beings at all. It's pretty rare for discarnate entities, for ghosts, basically. Negative hallucination is a terrible thing when you're driving. Yeah, if you didn't see the truck that you're about to run into, that would be pretty bad. That would definitely be a bad thing. Okay, John, you found your keys 5 years later, back of the freezer beside tons of food. I do have to say that every once in a while we have to make sure that our memories as human beings aren't creating problems for us, that we didn't put something in the fridge or freezer, and just because we're spacing out at that moment. I know I put something down somewhere. I'm pretty good visually. I have a pretty good visual memory. But every once in a while, I'm looking around for something. I realize, when I was putting something away in the fridge, I had my keys in my hand and I put them down on the shelf in the fridge and I forgot to pick them up. So we always do have to, in parapsychology, we do have to allow for human glitches too, in that sense. Okay. There's terrible nightmare, but that probably furthered the psychokinesis argument. And also, Susanna, I just want to mention that spontaneous PK is not uncommon for people who, when they try to do PK, can't do it. It's an unconscious thing. So there's that. Okay, I do want to mention, if you go back in the chat, and we'll post it again, that I did a panel discussion with a couple of folks, clinical psychologists and hypnotherapists from India, and an academic in the world of religion and bordering on anthropology from the UK. We did that a couple of days ago, and that is available on YouTube. And it's in the chat already. We'll put it in again in a little bit. Susanna, you might want to try using a pendulum so that your unconscious will tell you or show you where the keys happen to go. Or I think there's actually probably a good application for a good psychic who can find things, a finder of lost things. Maybe not be able to charge a lot of money, but somebody who could psychically remote view somebody's apartment or house and tell them where their keys happen to be. I think there's a job there for somebody who's good. Mary Prankster, hello. Is it true that cemeteries are the most haunted places? No, actually not. They're probably the least haunted places. Now, when I say that, typically when we talk about haunted, we're talking about residual stuff rather than apparitions. So cemeteries do, like every place else, will pick up emotion. And you might get a sense of, you go to a cemetery and you get a sense of grief and sadness and things like that. That's not from a spirit. That's from the people who were the mourners for the funerals that left that stuff behind. But, fact is, let's think about this. Ghosts are people too. Number one, it's rare that somebody is buried that quickly. And apparitions don't usually stick around that long. So that's number one. People don't stick around after death that long. We know that from people's experiences. And number two, why would you wait around for your body to be buried and then hang out at your body? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, unless there's some big party happening at the cemetery, for ghosts, of course. Maybe a cemetery worker who died, the caretaker or somebody. But yeah, cemeteries, they're spooky, but there's nothing paranormal going on in most of them in general. Let's see. Night Soul, somehow we might be influenced in a morphogenic way by the thought of someone else, like the 100th monkey. It's possible. We've had long discussions about people's unconscious PK, and it can, we can affect things ourselves. We also sometimes unconsciously pick certain pathways or make certain decisions based on unconscious psychic perceptions as well. It's unlikely that, unless there's a lot of thought put into it. There was an experiment that was done with a group of meditators, a large group of meditators. I think there might have been Buddhist meditators trying to focus on and pray for and meditate on a lowered crime rate in, if I recall correctly, it was DC. This is many, many years ago. And what was interesting was over the next few months, there was a lower crime rate. Now, don't know if that was cause and effect or whether that was someone decided to do DC and bring the group together because they precognitively knew that was going to happen. That's always a question for us. But that was an interesting thing. So we've had this long discussions about people being really, really psychic unconsciously, especially with psychokinesis. And it seems that, we have a shared reality that we agree on, and you'd need a lot of people who believe in something to make that change, that kind of ripple in affecting people some way. And that hasn't really, to our knowledge, it hasn't happened. But I do want to make mention of a book a science fiction book. And there's been a couple of versions of the movie of it made into a movie and a miniseries. It's a book called The Lathe of Heaven. And I highly recommend this book. It's by Ursula K. Le Guin, one of the grand dames of science fiction. I recommend any of her stuff. Her dad was a very famous anthropologist named Alfred Kroeber. So she was immersed in culture and everything. The Lathe of Heaven is about a guy who goes to see a psychiatrist. And the guy tells him that he dreams about a change in the world. And when he wakes up the next day, the world has changed. And nobody knows, because it's not only changed the world in the moment, it's the change has happened all the way back in time. And eventually the psychiatrist starts believing him. And so he gives suggestions to this guy, such as, let's get rid of racism. Everybody should be, not think about it. So the world wakes up the next day, and you know what? Everybody's gray. There's never been any sort of racial separation. Everybody's the same color. Everybody's gray. History has changed, all of that. There are many, many examples they go through this, and then things start going off the rails. It's a really interesting book. The movies are pretty interesting too, but the book is great. Yeah, I mean, Ursula, that book is really wonderful. There are a whole bunch of other books. She dealt with a lot of cultural issues in her books. So highly recommend her stuff. She also wrote fantasy, the Earthsea saga. So if you're into fantasy, I'd recommend her books, those books as well. All right. Forests are haunted places. Why would forests be haunted places? Unless they're animal ghosts. Certain forests have got a reputation for being creepy and spooky. And then there's the suicide forest in Japan, which, people go to commit suicide. And that's probably left a lot of crap, pain and sorrow and all that behind. So you walk in there, from what I understand, and you feel it. So haunted, yes. Spirits, not necessarily. Two different things when it comes right down to it. I wonder if people who are cryogenically frozen are haunting their frozen bodies. So there's a question about, I've always had this question. You're not really dead if you're cryogenically frozen, if consciousness is merely the brain. But if the brain ceases function, as with a near-death experience, does your consciousness go elsewhere? I mean, can those people actually be revived? Will the consciousness that left them, if it left, come back? Or is putting the body and brain, the brain in stasis, effectively, going to put consciousness in stasis as well? So it's a question. I'll just throw it out there. Mary Prankster, you just finished Wizard of Earthsea. Yeah, that's a great book. I haven't read her stuff in a long time, but I read a whole slew of her books back in the 60s and 70s. Really fascinating stuff. I assume, Susanna, that's in reference to the cryogenic thing, haunting their own bodies. I've not heard of anyone's ghost showing up at the cryo facility to haunt what's been frozen, or asking for help, for that matter. I don't know of any situations like that. So that would be pretty interesting to find out. I want to mention I am teaching a new class. I've taught it before. Starting on Thursday. It's a 4-week class, 4 Thursdays. Of course, it is recorded as well, so you don't have to attend live, although it's better if you do, called Presenting the Paranormal to the Public. And the course is for anyone who has any intention of speaking, writing, interacting with people about the paranormal, about psychic phenomena, psychic experiences, and wants some guidance on how to do better at that. The first week, I talk about credibility, how to sound credible, how to talk to people about this stuff so they won't think you're crazy, and how not to care when some people do think you're crazy. So it's all about language, about the language we use, the concepts we use, the concepts we shouldn't use, things like that, how to discuss things with different audiences, all of that. And then I also talk about public speaking in week 2, some of the best public speaking skills you can pull together. I have worked as a public speaking coach over the years for executives and some lawyers, folks in the field in parapsychology, and also even for a few magicians and mentalists over the years. So I've got a lot of experience. I've been teaching public speaking for many, many years. The third week, talking about media and how to be a good interviewer, but more importantly, if you're going to be interviewed by somebody, how to prep, how to be a good interview subject, whether that is for a podcast, television, which so many people want to be on, if you're going to do TV or even YouTube stuff, how to appropriately work TV, basically how to be good on camera, all of that stuff. And then the last week I talk about publishing and writing, and not how to write, but some things that are ins and outs of the publishing world that and self-publishing that you might be interested in, and they kind of bringing it all together. For many years, I taught a course at John F. Kennedy University, a graduate school course, which was a full course, which included public speaking, media skills, and publishing. And so all of this is coming out of many years of teaching this and my own personal experience as well. Just everything I've done over my life. So if you're interested in that, registration is open through this week, actually even through next week. And it's just the Rhine Research Center's education arm. So it's rhineedu.org, rhineedu.org. Or just go to Rhine, rhine.org, and click on the education button. There are also some other really interesting classes, including one on lucid dreaming, that are being offered by others. So take a look and see what we offer. And hopefully never known anyone with the kind of memory for names and dates and statistics you have, Lloyd. Yeah, except when I meet somebody for the first time and I can't remember their name like 5 seconds later. If I see their name, I'm very visual. So if I see their name and hear their name, I'm more likely to remember their name. But I can't tell you the number of times that I've met people. I know their faces. I can sometimes associate faces with something else, but I can't for the life of me. This goes back since I was a kid. The funny thing was, and I'll just mention this, I was a bartender through grad school, right after college and through grad school, and for a little while after that, at a number of places in New York, and then in the Westchester County area, and then when I moved back out to California, here in the Bay Area. And I would have regulars, and sometimes, I would completely blank on the person's name, the regulars' names, or anybody else for that matter. Didn't matter how many times they told me their name, but I knew what they drank if they drank the same thing. So I would meet somebody on the street. They'd say, "Hi, Lloyd." And I'd recognize the face and they'd say, "Johnny Walker Red on the Rocks, right?" And that would be more impressive than my remembering their name. So I always let people know. And even when I'm performing, I've been up on stage performing mentalism, and somebody tells me, I ask, "So tell the audience your name." And they say Kevin. And that goes right out of my head. So I've come up with a way of dealing with that. And I just simply call them like by 5 different names in the next few minutes. Just gets a laugh for that. All right. I do remember my colleagues. I do remember a lot of stuff about what I've read. I am not as nearly even close to as good as some of my colleagues in remembering various forms of literature. And my late colleague, Carlos Alvarado, who was one of my fellow students and graduates at John F. Kennedy University's parapsychology program, Carlos had an amazing memory. He could tell you what journal article had what and who wrote it and when it was published. And he knew the old literature really well. We had a big loss when we lost him. And we've had occasional people like that. When you worked at UCal Berkeley, there was a barista who did the same thing with coffee drinks. A lot of people who work in the service industry, like in the restaurant industry and the food industry, there were other bartenders I knew the same thing. They remembered what they poured for people. I've known baristas like that who if you're regular, they often remember that. Never remember your damn name. And it's just because there's a visual component when you're pouring things, when you're making drinks. I mean, I actually had a good enough visual memory that I could work really fast at a bar. I would start working at some place, and by the second day, I could reach behind me and pick the right bottle off the shelf without even looking, because I knew where it was, unless somebody moved it. Just visually, it just was there. So a lot of muscle memory, too. All right. So You're looking at my shirt. I see Graveyard Grog. So I have a really interesting ghost shirt here. I will try to show it a little better right now. You can see a lot of different ghosts here. And there's even some monsters towards the bottom. One of the coolest shirts I've got. So, okay. Questions, comments. By the way, Slimer is on the shirt as well. So, you know, always fun. Okay. Let me think what else is going on. So, for anyone who's interested, the Parapsychological Association is having its annual scientific convention in Mexico. Merida, I think is where it is, towards the end of August. If you go to parapsych.org and click on the convention link, you can actually find out. It actually should be on the first page. It is open registration. I am not going for a number of reasons. Just timing-wise, it's really not working out for me. But for anybody who's really interested in the hard science and the science that's there, I would strongly suggest you think about it. This time, I'm not sure where it's going to be next year. It'll be somewhere in the U.S. next year for sure. And I should probably be going next year. Last year was in Oslo, Norway. Didn't make that one either. Let's see. Any new interviews coming up? Yes, Paul, I do have some. But I have no idea. They're all I have like 3 or 4 set up, and they're all pre-recorded. So I couldn't tell you when they're going to show up. I'll try to get links for them after the fact, and once they've sent me the links, I'll put them in the chat in a subsequent session of this this show. But more and more folks, it's actually good for me that they are pre-recording, simply because sometimes my schedule does. I've had to turn some podcasts down because I just couldn't do them at the time. There was one, so I always have to remind folks who are asking me for podcasts. A lot of times they don't tell me what time zone they're in, and I'm on the West Coast. So it's sometimes interesting when somebody asks me for what sounds like a reasonable time, and turns out to be 6 in the morning Pacific time. So I don't do those. As it is, Graveyard Grog, if you will place that link back in the chat again. When I did Tell Me Your Story, the panel the other day, that's on YouTube, we were trying to determine the timing because, as I mentioned, one of the folks was in India, another in the UK. So I got stuck doing something at 7:30 in the morning, which is much earlier than I would ever normally have done. I did okay. It's always sometimes difficult for me. In fact, I have a day job, and I don't tend to schedule anything before 9 a.m. and sometimes 8 a.m. Pacific. And we have occasional company town halls and things like that, and even mandatory meetings that they want people to attend. And they're at a reasonable time on the East Coast, 9 a.m. on the East Coast, but that's 6 a.m. here, and I just simply, everybody knows, don't expect Lloyd to be there. I'll watch a recording. Night Soul's longtime follower Krishnamurti, is there an experience before we experience it, or we experiences before the experience happens? Okay. Well, according to one model of psychic functioning, the first sight theory and model by James Carpenter, as well as similar models from others in the field, ESP, non-sensory perception, psychic perception, is always scanning the environment and may always be scanning a little bit into the future. In research and precognition, it seems that we're really good with precognition 5 to 15 seconds ahead of time. In fact, our bodies will often react to a stimulus before the actual stimulus. So you can say that there is an experience before the experience in that way, because we're aware that it's happening. It's going to be happening. So are we the experiencers before the experience happens? If you want to include Precognition, absolutely, we are. Otherwise, it's getting into a weird language loop, as far as I can tell. Um, so the convention, in fact, I can kind of take a look and see real quick here. Again, if you go to parapsych.org, and I'll just put the link in here, if I can spell it right. It is going to be, let's see. Just trying to, here's the event. It is going to be in, where is that? Merida, Mexico. So Merida. That's what I thought it was. One of my colleagues, Ramses de Leon, who has done some of his own investigations, field investigations, is one of the convention chairs there. So yeah, I'm sorry I'm not going to be there. There's a number of reasons why, like I said, timing wise, and some other things as well right now. Susanna, I called a friend in Israel once. He wasn't responding. Normally it was 2 a.m. there. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, I still remember a call in the 80s after I got a lot of publicity for Ghostbusters, and the parapsychology program at JFK University got a lot of publicity for Ghostbusters. Somebody looked me up, and my phone rang at just after 3 in the morning, and the guy was asking me about the parapsychology program, and I was like, I couldn't believe he's calling me at 3 in the morning. He said he was in Florida, and he just didn't understand the time zone difference. He thought he was calling at 9 a.m., not 3 a.m., because he was calling, it was 6 a.m., just after 6 a.m. in Florida. So before you call someone out of the country or in different parts of the country, make sure you're aware of the timing and the time zones. That's kind of important. Okay. You're welcome, Night Souls. Frank Malone, you know any Norwegian parapsychologists? Not off the top of my head. But if you go to the Parapsychological Association's website, there is a membership list, and there are links to folks. Most of the folks have a link of some kind that take you to a bio or profile, or even to their own website. But like I said, I didn't go last year, so I'm not sure who was. I believe that last year the convention chair was Etzel Cardinia, who's in Sweden. I'm not sure why it was in Oslo, specifically in Norway, but Cardinia is actually in Sweden. So he's kind of the chair. Technically he's the chair of parapsychology. There's not really a parapsychology program though. That's there. Okay, so a little slow down here. Anybody else with a question right now? All right. Well, I'll mention if you go to the Parapsychological Association's website, there's a lot of other information there. You don't have to be a member to get to some of it. There is a glossary of psychic terms, of parapsychological terms and concepts. There's a whole page blog page on skepticism in relation to parapsychology. There are a number of articles on psychic functioning, psychic ability. Quite a bit of some information about other programs on university education. There's a frequently asked questions page as well. So the Parapsychological Association is the official academic, scientific organization of people in the field. Not everybody who is a parapsychologist is in the Parapsychological Association. I will mention that. Some folks are not joiners in that way for whatever reason, or are approaching things a little differently. So there are people who are not members, but if somebody claims to be a parapsychologist, that's a good place to start. Another place is to ask Professor Paranormal. You can also ask or send an inquiry over to the Rhine Research Center, just rhine.org. Just check that, because one of the things that comes up within our field is we get these questions every time, once in a while, and it's like, is so and so actually a parapsychologist? They're a ghost hunter who's claiming blah blah blah. And it turns out, into looking into what their background is, I always suggest people look and see if they claim a PhD in parapsychology from anywhere in the United States, they probably got it from a diploma mill of some kind. The only person who has ever earned an actual PhD in which says parapsychology on the degree itself, from a U.S. university, an accredited university, is Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove. That was from UC Berkeley. There was a parapsychology program at John F. Kennedy University. My diploma actually is a Master of Science in parapsychology. That does not mean that someone who does not have a degree in parapsychology cannot be a parapsychologist, because most of the people in the field, there's such limited availability of that specific degree. Most people come from psychology, from anthropology, from physics, and they work in the field, or they do something in their dissertation or thesis that's related to psychic phenomena, to the paranormal, from an academic scientific perspective. And they earn a degree that may say physics, but they're working in parapsychology in that way. But then there are a lot of people who, and I've seen a number of people, and I've had to kind of say things to certain people on podcasts sometimes, that claim a degree, a PhD, which is a doctorate, that's an advanced degree in parapsychology, which they got from a non-accredited school, which is not even a university or college. I don't know if it still exists, but there was a so-called university, air quotes, in a town in Florida that was giving out degrees in parapsychology, PhDs and master's degrees. And the PhD program, normally for a PhD, you've got to do a dissertation or a major project. And typically that's like writing a book. It's a huge amount of work for things. I chose, in fact, to write books for the public instead. So this school was asking for, I believe it was for your dissertation, a 15-page paper. I wrote that for a freshman year college course. There was nothing to speak of scientific parapsychology. It was all metaphysical stuff. They were offering this degree in parapsychology. And the best thing was, when I saw this, was their claim that they were licensed, fully licensed. Well, that's different than being accredited by an educational organization. And when I looked into it, they were licensed because they had a business license for the town in which they operated. I have a business license for the town in which I claim my home office to do writing and performing and and lecturing and all that stuff. You pay the town a certain amount of money to have a business license. It's based on your income. It has nothing whatsoever to do with what you're doing at all. So stuff like that, and there are tons of diploma mills that are offering degrees in parapsychology and all sorts of things that are completely bogus. So if someone says they're a parapsychologist, I don't remember, John, where it is. It's been a while since I've actually looked for that. I'll see if I can dig that up, and maybe I'll try to remember to send that to you or post it next time. It was not a major city. I remember that. Somewhere in Central Florida. But if somebody claims to be a parapsychologist, ask them why they call themselves that and what their educational background is. And I'll be very honest with you. Unfortunately, doing investigations does not make you a parapsychologist. You got to know something about parapsychology. There was a woman here locally who was a ghost hunter, and she started calling herself a parapsychologist. She knew nothing about the field of parapsychology. All she knew was stuff she had learned from watching TV shows and from other ghost hunters who generally know nothing about parapsychology. So they got to at least know something about the field, let alone, even if they don't work in the field, they got to know something about the field. that's partly what my class is about this coming week. So anyway, enough of a little bit of a rant there. I will just step aside and mention if you're old enough to remember phone books and the yellow pages back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, even into the 90s, they're often in many yellow pages. I know there was one here in the Bay Area. There was a category in yellow pages for advertising, and it says parapsychologists. And almost nobody in that listing was a parapsychologist. They were, for the most part, psychics and mediums. There was not a category for psychics and mediums, so the phone company put them in parapsychologists because in the 60s, some psychics started calling themselves parapsychologists, and it kind of caught on with a lot of psychic practitioners because it sounded more credible than calling yourself a psychic. But that would be like calling yourself a psychologist because you have a mind. So if they are all parapsychologists, then we are all psychologists. And that actually, just as a little funny story, back in one of our parapsychology conventions, which was hosted at Sonoma State University here in the Bay Area, I think Charles Tart was the convention chair then, with somebody local that was local there. We had someone speak to us from the Board of Behavioral Services, which is the organization, the board that actually licenses psychologists and therapists, psychotherapists in California. And she gave a very serious talk about how unless you are a psychologist with an advanced degree or a licensed therapist, you should not call yourself a parapsychologist. And that's partly because there is a law on the books for every state that the American Psychological Association somehow ramrodded through that says that if you are using the word psychology or psychologist in your job title, your occupation, you must have the appropriate background. And then it listed all the functions, all the things that a psychologist does that people should not be doing unless they're a psychologist or a psychotherapist. First one was counseling. Did you know that somebody who is an MD or someone who is a JD, in other words, a lawyer with a Juris Doctor, is legally empowered to do counseling just like a psychotherapist? They can do whatever the hell they want and not catch any guff from it. Another thing listed was interviewing, and the way it was described, it fit reporters or anybody doing interviews or TV viewers, not just psychologists. There were a lot of things in there that just made no sense. So however they got that law through, it really has not been enforced for a lot of reasons, with rare exception. So after this is all over, I just asked her, I asked the woman, so I have a master's in parapsychology from an accredited university. It's on my diploma. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a parapsychologist. Can I call myself a parapsychologist? And she said, no, but you can say you have a degree in parapsychology because I said, so what would happen if I continue to call myself a parapsychologist? She said, well, somebody complains to us, we will have to go after you. There might be fines and everything else. And I said, really? And then if I then went to started filing complaints about every single person in all the yellow pages who advertise as a parapsychologist, they're all psychics, by the way, what'll that do to the Board of Behavioral Services? And she turned pale and said, you can call yourself a parapsychologist. Because they would never be able to handle that number of people. I mean, as it is, the Board of Behavioral Services can barely handle complaints as it is, even back then. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that there. It was kind of a fun thing. Do you prefer research, field research, or academic research? Field research, absolutely. Which can be academic, certainly scientific, but I never really was, I thought originally when I got into the field I was going to be going and doing lab work, experiments in the laboratory, and I participated in it some. More frequently for me, I have consulted with with some of my colleagues who do academic research, laboratory research on laboratory controls because of my background in magic and mentalism. That has suited me much, much better. So I'm interested in academic research. I'm interested in the research that's done. I talk about it. I read journal articles about it. But frankly, the statistics. So it's always about the math, isn't it? It's too repetitive for me. I prefer dealing with people more than anything else. So thanks for asking that question. All right, 6:21 on my clock here. We've got about 9 more minutes. Let's see if we have any other questions. Remember, you can ask me also about pop culture related to psychic phenomena, to the paranormal, and you can even ask me about chocolate. And you can ask me even why I mentioned that, if you want. Or magic and mentalism. And I will say that on the magic and mentalism front, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube, which is unfortunately revealing how magicians do certain things. And thank you, Susanna. There are, actually elements of academic research that are in field research. I mean, it's if you're approaching it from the applied science perspective, not the TV perspective. All right, Night Souls. When you were young, someone showed me a tape of Michael Talbot about the holographic universe, and ever since, wow, 44 is still full of passion. So many questions come up every day. For anyone who has not read Michael Talbot's book, The Holographic Universe, order it from Amazon now. Read that book. It will blow your mind. It is absolutely amazing. It's an amazing concept. It makes a lot of sense from a visceral perspective. Really, really interesting stuff. All right. Okay, Paul, when will the survival class of the Rhine be available? Not again until next spring, at least. Because we just finished it. In fact, I just finished grading yesterday. All right, so I just want to point out a couple things about YouTube. If you would like a laugh of sorts, there is a video. In fact, I will try to find it here real quick on YouTube called Magicians Prove the Spiritual World Exists. Magicians Prove a Spiritual World Exists. And there are several versions of this, but let me get the link here. It's from some religious guy. Oops, let me go back and get this here. And let me talk. I'm going to put this in the chat. I'm only recommending you watch this. You'll never get through it. It's over 3.5 hours. You'll never get through it. The guy who does it, it's a narration, and it's apparently a religious guy. I don't know if he's a monk or whatever, but his thesis in this whole 3.5 hour thing is that magicians can't really do what we see them doing from a human perspective. They must have made a deal with the devil. The interesting thing about this, first of all, number one, this guy is really, really, really monotonous, and I can't listen to it for more than 5 minutes at a time. I usually turn the sound off. And however, he has collected some of the best clips of magicians performing on television from around the world. I mean, it's an amazing collection of clips of magicians doing everything from card tricks to big illusions, which obviously human beings can't do without making a deal with the devil, even though anybody can learn to do those things. Big illusions, you need the money for that. You can find the secret, but you still need the money to actually do them. And today there's way too many people who are exposing magic tricks. Not that there's, just know that there's more than one way to do a trick too. Just really important to know. Sometimes, because I know this for a fact, from my studies, from my working in magic, my working in mentalism, the exact same effect can be produced in a couple different ways. So really interesting here. All right, so I'm gonna the books of Lynn McTaggart are also good. All right, I put that link in there to there are links to both versions of the video. I will tell you again, you never make it through the whole 3.5 hours at one sitting. If you do, and you really, really, really did that in one sitting, let me know. I might actually send you something. Okay, Frank Malone. In most countries, if you have a graduate degree in psychology and psychology is what you do, you are a psychologist. That is correct. The U.S., there's you have to be careful about whether you're a practicing psychologist or a clinical psychologist. You need a license for that in most states, but you can be a psychologist otherwise, certainly, academically and otherwise. All right. My son wants to know if there's any legitimate the obelisk spirit box. Not if you mean, does it really pick up for sure spirits? No. First of all, there's a bit of guesswork for a lot of those spirit boxes because you're applying what you think you hear to a question you've asked or are thinking of. And it's rare that it's clear enough and a direct answer to a question that even happens. Secondly, we know living human beings can affect devices. We have tons of laboratory evidence of that. And if, in fact, the obelisk is working off a random system, except when some consciousness affects it, to pick the right word, it could easily be the unconscious mind of the operator, not a spirit. You need some other sign that there's a spirit there to even connect the idea that any of the technology is picking up a spirit. There's no device that absolutely picks up spirits at all. We don't know what we're trying to pick up. I mean, you can't use an FM radio to pick up an AM signal. So we have no way of doing that. Is table tipping magic or can be moved by spirit entities? Well, the idea of table tipping is that the people doing it, it's called an idiomotor response. It's kind of like using a pendulum or a Ouija board or dowsing rods, same kind of thing. It doesn't exclude the possibility that spirits are interacting with the living people, causing or kind of interacting to make that happen, or even picking up information. Same thing with the Ouija board. Maybe you are picking up actual information unconsciously from a spirit, but the spirits don't necessarily interact with the table itself. Otherwise, they could levitate the table without you touching it in that way. All right, we're at 1 minute here. Thought can influence the outcome of a computer. That is correct. There's significant research about human-machine interaction that's out there that shows that, and it actually even shows that people who hate computers will make their computers break. And when you are frustrated and upset and you try to use your computer or your smartphone, you may be causing a problem, temporary problem, for your computer. If it starts acting up, it's because of you. Same thing with your printer and everything else. So it happens to me, happens to pretty much everybody. That's an unconscious PK effect, assuming you have not hit the wrong keys or that it's just Windows or something. All right, thanks everybody for joining. Our next session is going to be in 2 weeks, which I believe is August 11th. And I hope to see you back again. Please tell your friends. Please subscribe if you have not. Please like and subscribe. Tell your friends about this. The past episodes are all here as well. And you can also send me questions in advance, if you like, to simply askprofparanormal@gmail.com or profparanormal@gmail.com, either one of those. So either ask prof, as in PROF, paranormal@gmail.com or profparanormal@gmail.com. Thanks, everybody. And I hope you all have a good couple of weeks and a good night tonight. Take care.